mute, but any questions that you might have, please drop them in the chat and we'll go through them towards the end. We've got 50 minutes, so lots of time. But in the meantime, Jason, over to you.
Great. Good afternoon, everyone, and thanks for that introduction, Andrew. And it's great to see all the people actually in the room there in Brisbane. I lived for my first 4 years in Brisbane and spent, hello, everybody, spent a short time working at Kelvin Grove too. So it's great to get a little snapshot into my old stomping grounds. So I'm going to be talking about, as Andrew said, I'm going to be talking about modern monetary theory and the contribution it can make to developing a well-being economy in Australia. Before I get started, I want to acknowledge that I'm speaking from a Rockwell country, and that this is stolen Aboriginal land, sovereignty was never ceded, and that exploitation and dispossession are still ongoing processes relevant to today. And on the issue of sovereignty, I will begin. So most governments in the world today issue their own currencies. That includes Australia. And they have a legal monopoly on its issuance. So for example, counterfeiting is a serious crime. And provided those currencies have a floating exchange rate, so in other words, they're not pegged to any other country's currency, nor gold, nor anything else, MMT refers to this as a sovereign currency. And it's important to highlight here that this is only the case for the federal or national government, who is the issuer of the currency. It's not true for state or local governments who, like us, are users rather than issuers of the currency. Okay, and the flip side of a sovereign currency is the legal monopoly on the use of force, which is an important part of the MMT story, which I'll share with you now. Okay, so any theory of money needs at very least to explain why it is that people value the money and use this money. And the short answer that MMT gives is to pay taxes. And the story goes something like this. So the government wants to provision itself. It wants to have an army, it wants to have a police force, doctors, teachers, etc. And to get those people working, it first needs to impose a tax liability to get those people working. So for example, it imposes the tax liability, which is like a threat. If you don't pay the tax, then the government will dispossess you of your land or your property or put you in jail or something like that. And it is in this way that sovereign money is thus underpinned by the use of force. Okay, so this tax liability by definition creates unemployment. The reason is that people don't want to have their land taken away or their property taken away. They don't want to go to jail. So the government is threatening with this use of force if they don't pay taxes. So suddenly you have all these people looking for the government's currency so that they can pay it. So people looking for paid work who don't yet have it, by definition are unemployed. And so from the beginning, it's important to highlight that it's not so much our taxes that the government wants, but our labor. And this opens up a big question of what sort of work we value in our society and what sort of work we want done. And that discussion can contribute to what this conference is about. Of course, we want to have an economy focused on well-being rather than narrowly on GDP growth. Okay, so that's step one in the MMT story. So the government imposes a tax liability and it gets people looking for paid work. So step two is, now that there's unemployment, step two is for the government to spend the currency into the economy, offering employment in the army, the police force, doctors, nurses, etc. Now, it's important to understand that there is no nominal limit to the amount that the government can spend. So remember, the sovereign government has a legal monopoly on the issuance of the currency, and they simply spend it into the economy by keystrokes. And it's also important to point out, and we'll come back to this at the end, that while there's no nominal limit to the government spending, there is a real limit to the productive capacity of an economy based on the availability of resources, both material resources and labor resources. And again, we'll come back to that a little bit later too. Okay, so the government spends the money, and the government spending is its debt, which in turn is the public's credit. So from this perspective, government debt, again, we're talking about the national government debt, is not only not bad, but it's necessary and potentially beneficial, again, depending on what they're spending on. If they're spending to invest in schools and hospitals, that's great, or are they busy financing wars? Excuse me, again, that contributes to the purpose of this conference. What sort of labor or productivity do we value? One more point I'm going to make in relation to this is what's called the household fallacy. So governments do not and should not operate their accounts like a household, but trying to balance the budget. Users of the currency must do this. So you and I must do this, and local and state governments must do this too, and businesses. But the national government is the issuer of the currency, and it can always, therefore, afford to buy whatever is available for sale in its own currency, and it can never go bankrupt in its own currency. It can go bankrupt in a foreign currency, and I think Argentina holds the world records for most defaults in a foreign currency. And I guess technically the government could choose to go bankrupt in its own currency, but it can never be forced to do so, as long as it meets these sovereign currency conditions. Okay, so a couple other points before we go on is that the government has to spend at least as much as it demands in taxes to be paid, otherwise unemployment will result. And it's worth noting that unemployment has been a pervasive feature of neoliberalism since about the 1970s on. In fact, 1975 was the first year that Australia abandoned the full employment policy, which it had considered at 2%. And we'll come back to that a little bit later. And the last thing I'm going to say on this slide is just to comment on the picture in front of you. What's ironic about it, at least by my interpretation, is that while the insinuation is that the national debt, which is the government spending, is a bad thing, and that it's too high, I should say, in reality, the opposite is probably true, and as evidenced by this destitute and probably unemployed man that you can see in the foreground. Okay, so the government imposes a tax liability, and then it spends the money into the economy, offering employment. And then finally, the last step is that the government redeems the currency by collecting the taxes and extinguishing its debt. So while many people believe that a government has to spend first before it can collect, that governments have to tax first in order to spend, MMT argues exactly the opposite is true. Governments have to spend first and then tax. And just to give a recent example for Australia, was the government's response to COVID. So I think the federal government spent about somewhere on the order of $100 billion on JobKeeper, and there was no need to raise taxes first. And I think everybody sort of intuitively knows this, but MMT helps to put all these pieces together to make it really, really clear. Okay, so that's the money story. So what? What are the implications of this, and how can it contribute to the purpose of this conference? To begin with, MMT shows that there's no natural so-called rate of unemployment. So unemployment and austerity more generally have been used as a tool by governments to keep inflation down, as per what's called the Phillips curve, an inverse relation between inflation and unemployment. And for those of you who may have studied standard economics, neoclassical economics in university, you probably also came across what's called the NERU, which is an acronym for the non-accelerating inflation rate of unemployment, describing that relationship. But it's important to understand from an MMT perspective, unemployment is a political choice. It's not an economic imperative. Little tidbit of history too is that all Western governments, including Australia, pursued successfully a full employment policy following the end of World War II until the beginning of the neoliberal era in the 1970s, when unemployment began to creep up. And so unemployment has hit young people especially hard. I couldn't believe the statistics the first time I read them, but according to the ABS today, about 1 in 3 young people in Australia, so those aged between 15 and 24, are either unemployed or underemployed. So the underemployed are those people who have work, paid work, but they want more and they can't find it. So between the two of those, unemployment and underemployment, the ABS calls that underutilization. So 1 in 3 young people in Australia today, approximately, are underutilized. And this trend is extends globally. It's not specific to Australia. So according to a recent ILO, International Labor Organization report, young people are about 3 times as likely to be unemployed as their adult counterparts. And this is similar, as I say, around the world. You have got places like Spain and Greece where fully half of all young people are unemployed, and places like South Africa are even worse. You've got about 2 in every 3 young people are unemployed. And this says nothing about the wages that they're making, which have been stagnant for decades, or the conditions that they're working under, which have also been eroded, concomitant with a reduction in union activity. All of this is an attack on the population and has hit young people especially hard. And according to MMT, doesn't have to be that way. So to come more pointedly now to the purpose of this conference and how this can contribute to a well-being economy, it should be noted, I'm going to make 2 points that come out of the World Happiness Reports, which are, at least to my mind, sort of the gold standard of synthesizing the research in happiness and well-being. This research has been going on by social psychologists and economists for many decades now. And the two points that come out of it is, number one, is that employment is closely correlated with people's levels of reported levels of well-being or happiness or life satisfaction or whatever you want to call it, and higher than those who are not employed. And that's true even for people who don't like their jobs. So even people who don't like their jobs report on average higher levels of well-being than people who are unemployed. And I don't say that because I'm trying to promote meaningless jobs or just make work projects, but just to emphasize the connection between well-being and employment. So at the moment, unemployment is sort of like a game of musical chairs, where a definite and growing number of people, especially young people, are left out of employment and the opportunity to do paid work and the associated higher levels of life satisfaction. And as I say, that's a political choice. It's not an economic imperative. The second point I want to make before I go on is that, for right or for wrong, this also comes out of the World Happiness Reports, but for right or for wrong, people judge their own well-being relative to others. So this is comes out of a relation, one of the interpretations, I should say, of what's called the Easterlin paradox, and the work of a pioneering economist named Richard Easterlin. And it's worth noting on this topic that the advertising industry spends about $500 billion every year trying to ensure that people are indeed comparing themselves to others. This is a huge public liability. But the point is that limiting inequality, to address the purpose of this conference, that also limiting inequality is also a key factor in promoting well-being. Okay, one more implication, and then I'm going to turn it over to Selvin and to the audience. And this is more, both of these points are directly relevant to my own research. So, so the first one has to do with the implication for education. So because of these high and increasing rates of un- and underemployment, education has become increasingly aimed at, with ever greater desperation, conferring what's called employability skills, as if the problem of unemployment is an educational one rather than a political and economic one. And with regard to full employment and the job guarantee, I gather Stephen Hale is in the audience there, and he's going to speak more to this in the next session. So I won't talk too much about it, but I will just say briefly that not only would this increase well-being on an individual level, as I was just describing, pursuing full employment, but it would also help to fill many important social functions that are badly needed. So, for example, as a teacher, I know that when there's another teacher aide in the classroom, it makes a huge difference to me and to the students as well. When you've got high unemployment and then you've got this need over here on the other side, that's not a very highly skilled job. It doesn't take that long to train somebody to work in that way. The only thing ultimately that's stopping this kind of thing from happening is a lack of, I guess, popular understanding and a political pressure to make it happen. But moreover, in terms of education, it would also free education from this ever greater desperation of trying to prepare young people for a competitive labor market and allow it to focus more on at least what I think is needed, which is pro-social values and critical thinking without the need to worry about sort of getting on in the world. All of this is possible as per MMT. So that's a possibility. And the last thing I'm going to say is about a limitation. As I mentioned, that there's no nominal limit to spending, but there is a real limit to the productive capacity of in an MMT or any economy. There's always going to be real limits to production on a finite planet. So the second question I would pose is, how could MMT be used to promote an ecologically sustainable society while simultaneously contributing to well-being? And put as a question, sorry, I forgot to put this one as a question, it's sort of a segue into the audience discussion, but for the possibility, I'd just like to invite the audience to consider what would education and society more generally look like where upon graduation, everyone was guaranteed a job at wages sufficient for a decent and dignified life. Okay, those are a few of my references. So I think I've taken about 16 minutes. We've got still about 2/3 of our time here. Maybe the best way to proceed is, I know Selvin is going to do a little demonstration, and then maybe we can have some question time, and then maybe some breakout groups. Looks like we've got 15 people online, and get some discussion going on, perhaps about these two questions or any other questions that comes up from the audience. So I'll hand it over back to you, Andrew, or over to Selvin now.
Thanks, Jason. I'll be guided by you. Straight over to Selvin. Thank you.
Thank you. So I've just put together a little fun exercise for us to just sort of explore the question of limits to MMT and in terms of the ecological limits, what can go wrong. And luckily, we've got this little nation of gnomes here.
Can I just interrupt for a second, Selwyn? Sorry. I just, Jason, would you be able to stop sharing your screen, please? Sorry. Thank you. And
hi.
Sorry.
So we've got our little nation of gnomes here. I think it's clear there. And they're going to help us do a little demo or pilot of what an MMT economy might look like or transitioning into one. And what can go wrong? Are there any limits? So historically, our little nation of gnomes here, they've been trading with commodity monies. So yeah, they've been using that to, you know, buy produce, and that's been going really well. Is it a sovereign currency? Yes, it is. So that's fantastic. So in the 70s, they decided, well, you know, it's really heavy carrying these coins around. I know it's great that, you know, you're trading, you know, a commodity with a commodity, but, you know, they're a bit clunky. So let's get rid of those. So get rid of those little coins, and instead let's give them some paper money. They're not actually worth anything intrinsically, they're just actually a piece of paper that's not really even worth what it's printed on, possibly. So fantastic. So nothing went wrong. You know, they've been buying produce, so they've been buying fruit, so with their money, banana, apple, and oranges. Yep. And that's going really great. So nothing bad happened, but coronavirus happened. And so the government decided it was going to try and spend more money into creation, incur more debts to stimulate the economy. And in order to do that, they decided to hire some, put out some jobs and get some extra jobs out there. So all the gnomes, actually, they can keep those. Put them back, okay, keep those. And they gave everyone some money, okay? So they spent more money into creation, created more jobs. So now they've got, he gets one too, even though he's not working, he's in isolation, this guy here. So now they can actually buy vegetables as well. So that's great. So they've got extra produce. Everyone is wealthier. The farmers are trading more. Everyone is like producing more in the economy. And there is excess goods to be traded. So, you know, the money actually went to do something good. Nothing went wrong. So that's actually basically MMT for you. The government spent money into creation and more goods were produced and exchanged. But what if we created more money? So say I'm gonna now give them all, I don't know, $100, okay? So they all got more money. I hope this is clear. It's a bit like hard to see over there, maybe, you know, sitting over here. All their dosh is getting a bit mixed up here, but you get the idea. So this is where we get a problem. There is a problem now. So there is actually a limit to land, labor, and real goods. Like, so the gnomes, they only ever were able to produce, you know, a certain amount of produce that was ecologically viable. And now they're going to try and outbid each other for this produce because there is actually only a certain number of stuff that can be created within this economy. So they might buy more fruit, you know, they can produce more fruit. There's capacity in the economy for producing more fruit. But that's basically it. So now they're going to try and outbid each other for that limited amount of produce. And that's real inflation for you. So I'm sure it's over 2% now, which is actually the usual target. But yeah, as far as like demonstrating the stage 2 or 3 of what happened when we printed a bit more money, you can say that. Nothing actually went wrong. So yeah, I think like all we have to remember is actually the limits of, the real limits to productive capacity based on real resources, be they material, labor, land. And I hope that this little demo was like a fun activity to just show everyone what it might look like. So I'll just maybe open up for audience input or some of the questions that Jay had put up on the slides, if we can flick back to that one there.
And Jason, do you mind sharing? Yeah, you've done it. Thank you.
So I have this is Andrew. I have a question from Akasha Rose to everyone. It looks like like placing economics in a historical context. Akasha, if you'd like to come off mute, you can actually ask in person your question, or I can read it out.
Hey, I was just,
excellent.
Oh yeah, it's just in the chat. I'm just interested in whether like we're talking about the decoupling of fiat and monetary systems from, I guess, real world kind of the real world of that we live in. It's just a concept. I'm just wondering how the Nixon shock kind of interacts with these theories, and how in the 70s the major currencies of the world were decoupled from gold, and basically, we're talking about inflation here, and whether that has any impact in these kind of ideas.
Yeah, that's a fantastic question. Thanks for asking it, Akasha. Yeah, so just so everyone in the audience knows, so up until from the end of World War II until 1971, there was what was called the Bretton Woods system, and this was the organization and the world system of finance that was put in place following World War II. And basically, what it was is that every country in the world pegged or narrowly pegged their currencies to the US dollar, and the US dollar itself was pegged to gold. And this system worked quite well up until 1971. But as Akasha mentioned, so Nixon abandoned the convertibility of the US dollar into gold at that time. And the reason they did that was because they had been bled dry from all their military adventuring in Korea and Vietnam, and they couldn't make the payments anymore. Michael Hudson has written a lot about this and has done all of the analysis on this for those who are interested in a lot of detail. But Akasha, yeah, you're absolutely right. So that was really the beginning of the MMT era, is because after that, well, not immediately, but yeah, the whole thing began to unravel, because then every country, so the US dollar was no longer pegged to gold. And then eventually most countries in the world allowed their countries to float relative to all other currencies. So that really was the beginning of the MMT era. So that's, yeah, that's a great question.
I'm glad I asked it. That was really good to know. Thank you.
Yeah, thanks.
Putting it in historical context, yeah.
Thanks there. Selvin, I can't see the audience, so I don't know whether people in the audience have their hands up. So I can field questions from the chat box, but you'll have to let me know if there's people in the audience who are wishing to speak.
I have a question.
Excellent, thank you.
So I heard the statement that people are happier when they're employed, and I'm just recognising that's in the context of a society that places acceptance and status on having employment. And you know, what we're seeing of the market as it operates now is that the desire to have people in work creates a whole lot of bullshit jobs where people are doing stuff that is actually harmful. So I was wondering whether, and I guess it's perhaps coming more back to something like UBI, but UBI plus a guarantee of mentorship to find a way to make a meaningful contribution, rather than somebody else deciding in advance where we're going to create these roles and then we'll just, you know, because it's a way of giving people a job.
Yeah, that's a fantastic question, Fiona. Thanks for asking. And I understand that Selvin co-hosted a discussion of the merits and demerits of UBI versus the job guarantee 2 days ago, I think it was. But yeah, it's a great question. Look, in my own research, actually, I got to be honest, I also have quite a like a critical stance on employment. I mean, I made the comments that I made in the context of, well, one, in the context of this conference about what it's about, and just drawing on that research from the World Happiness Reports. On the other hand, yeah, I agree with you, and I can see the shortcoming of it. And to be honest, I don't necessarily see the UBI and the job guarantee, or the government acting as employer of last resort, as mutually exclusive, and that maybe the two can be implemented together. I guess ultimately what it comes down, at least by my assessment, and I'm willing to hear other people's input as well, but what it really comes down to, I think, is how, first of all, how democratic this society is, and how much input people have into how much say they have into what jobs the government is willing to pay. I'm quite certain that I read that Simon Kuznets, who was, I think he was Nobel Prize, a big economist in 20th century, who was instrumental in creating the NEPA, or the National Income and Productivity Accounts, from which the GDP is measured. I'm certain that I read recently that he was he insisted that he wanted domestic work, which is usually work that women do, or care work. He wanted it to be included in the NEPA, but it's not. So it's invisible to capitalism. And people like Silvia Federici have been banging on about this for decades, about, why isn't this valued? Why? I mean, you could say that, yeah, okay, it is valued somewhat. There is, what is I can't remember the family tax benefit or whatever it is, the small nominal fee really that people who are doing this kind of domestic work get paid. But I mean, it's pretty cheap, really. It could be, and probably should be, much higher paid, but it's not. So ultimately, yeah, it comes down to thinking, how democratic is the society we live in? So, I mean, if you think it's not very democratic and you don't think it can be, then yeah, maybe it's, you lean more towards the UBI because it gives people the freedom to do what they want. To be honest, I have a bit of a socialist streak for me, and I'd like to think that people have these pro-social values, and we should collectively decide what sort of work needs to be done and value those appropriately. So, I mean, it's a really good question, and I don't have any simple answer for it. I'm still quite open, and maybe this can be a jumping off point. Unless there are any other questions from the audience, maybe it can be a jumping off point for generating a discussion about that question, or any of the other two on the screen. I don't know.
I think that's a really great idea, Jason, because I mean, I struggle with the same thing. I mean, if we had a UBI, a lot of people would be probably producing non-excludable public goods anyway. So therefore it wouldn't necessarily have an inflationary impact in terms of private goods and services, as was demonstrated by Selvin. We're not always buying bananas and vegetables and goods and services in a private market. Quite often we can produce things that won't have inflation. But let's pick up. There's a question, I don't know whether it's going to be related to it, from Jairi from that's coming online. If you'd like to put yourself off mute, even show your face if you like, and ask the question.
Hi, I'm just wondering, how does MMT relate to government bonds and also the weird shuffling of finance between Treasury and finance?
Okay, yeah, that's a really good question. Look, I'm going to say just something very briefly about this. I just, to the best of my understanding, I think Stephen Hale is in the audience there, and he's probably better qualified and more of an authority on this. But my understanding is basically goes like this: the central bank sets an interest rate target, and there's no market for the interest rate. And the bond market moves in inverse relation to the interest rate. So when the interest rate is low, the value of bonds goes up, and vice versa. Now the commercial banks, they have to meet a reserve requirement, and so when at the end of the day they may need to go and buy other reserves to meet that requirement, or they may have an excess and they may want to sell them. And they trade, again, this is my understanding, and maybe Stephen Hale can jump in right after this in case I've made a mistake, but my understanding is that they will swap, quite rationally, I guess you could say, they will swap the reserve, which historically doesn't earn any interest, or now I guess earns a very little bit of interest, but they will swap the reserve for the bond because the bond earns interest. And so depending on what the market is amongst the commercial banks, how much supply and demand there is for reserves or bonds, the government will step in and buy or sell bonds in order to adjust that demand so that it hits its interest rate target. That's my basic understanding. Is Stephen Hale there? Maybe can he jump in right now and maybe speak a little bit more to that? Or
and Andrew, I've just got Stephen here, and he's just coming online with his mic.
Hello.
We can hear you.
You can hear me. Oh, hi, Jason, and thanks for a great presentation.
Thank you.
Yeah, I can quickly maybe help a little bit with that issue. First of all, MMT has a descriptive part and a prescriptive part, and the job guarantee is almost always advocated by MMT economists, but it is part of the prescriptive and not the descriptive part. The descriptive part is how our monetary system works day to day, and particularly how the federal government interacts with the rest of the monetary system. So prior to the pandemic, for example, every day the federal government spent about $1.5 billion. We very rarely talk about printing money because actually every single time the federal government spends a dollar, it's an extra dollar in a bank account. So every dollar the federal government ever spends doesn't involve printing anything, it's electronic, but it creates currency. They then, of course, later, or as somebody said online, often virtually at the same time, are taxing back some of that money. When they tax dollars from our accounts, those dollars are not really going anywhere. The money supply falls again. So it actually destroys currency. Every dollar of federal taxes, that is literally true. So every dollar the government spends is a new dollar. Not getting into banking and credit creation for the moment, because this is not my presentation. Every dollar of taxation destroys a dollar. That's how it happens. When the government spends more than it taxes, it's creating more new dollars than it is destroying. That is a net deposit that the federal government is making in private sector bank accounts. It is also creating additional reserves for our private banks to hold themselves at the Reserve Bank. And it's those private bank reserves which are used to facilitate the millions of transactions that happen between us every day. There is no minimum requirement on those reserves and hasn't been for 20 years now, except that they're not allowed to go into overdraft. They have to stay as a plus number. The cash rate the Reserve Bank has a target for under normal circumstances, in other words, pre-pandemic, is the rate of interest at which banks lend those reserves to each other. So banks generally don't hold very much in the way of reserves. And because of interbank transactions, some banks get to the point where they are running out of reserves and need to borrow from other banks that have surplus reserves overnight. They do that at the cash rate. The Reserve Bank down the years, in order to control the cash rate, has had to limit the supply of cash to the banking system. And the way in which this has happened, the main way in which it has happened, is that following deficit spending by the government, which puts additional reserves into the system and would mean the banks all had more cash than they needed and would push the cash rate below the Reserve Bank's target unless those reserves were withdrawn again. Those reserves are drained from the system by having the Treasury auction new Treasury bonds. That is the purpose of Treasury bond issuance. It is to drain cash reserves to the banking system in defense of the Reserve Bank's cash rate target. And just right at the very end, because this might be a helpful thing to say, when Josh Frydenberg announced in March 2020 that he was prepared to do $200 billion of spending, if necessary, to support the economy during the pandemic, there were only $40 billion of those reserves in existence. Federal taxes or the payment of money for new Treasury bonds can only be made using those reserves. So it would have been literally impossible for Josh Frydenberg either to tax or to borrow those dollars before he spent them. They actually literally had to be spent into the system, or the RBA could have lent them into the system so that those dollars existed before Treasury bonds could have been auctioned in order to drain the reserves from the system again. I'm sorry if that's boring, but that's basically how the system works. That's my best attempt at explaining it.
Thanks, Stephen. I think you're going to have another go very shortly, so we might leave it there. Are there any more questions from the audience in the room?
No, nothing on this side. Thanks, Andrew.
Oh, we do.
Oh, there's a hand up.
We have one more.
Yeah, my question, can you hear me on this one?
We can, yes.
If my understanding of MMT around the world is that you can actually bankrupt your own currency against other currencies if you don't produce well. So what happens, say, for example, if Australia overspends its MMT, but other countries don't, and our own dollar currency diminishes in relation to currency exchange with other countries?
Yeah, maybe. Yeah, that's a good question. I'm not sure I totally understand it. I mean, okay, that's a political choice. I mean, that would change the exchange rate with that country, but why is that such a big deal? I mean, this is the way that I've heard Warren Mosler respond to this kind of question. So, and it makes sense to me. I mean, some people would be hurt by it if they're importers or exporters. It would change, the exchange rate. But I mean, the sovereign government and the sovereign currency are really focused, or should be focused, primarily on the domestic economy first and foremost, and our well-being here. I mean, it's the Australian government's should be, I think, the responsibility to look after the well-being of its citizens, and then maybe to consider about the well-being of other nations' citizens. But I mean, yeah, so that may be true, but I just don't see why why that's really very important. I don't know, maybe Stephen Hale can jump in here again, but that's my understanding, if I understood the question correctly.
Whether there's anything happening.
For the benefit of those people watching online, whoever was asking the question in the room, can you just borrow the microphone for a moment so we can hear it?
We were just saying that someone was just wondering about a job guarantee at a federal or state level.
Yes, I think that's what Jason wanted a few minutes to discuss. So I think that's probably a good time to introduce our preferences in terms of UBI or job guarantee or something in the middle.
I was just going to point out that there is a question from Jairi in the chat, wondering if there's anywhere that is doing a job guarantee at the federal or state level.
The one I know about is Spain certainly undertook some trials. So I've dropped a link in the chat there to a Nature article that talks a little bit about Spain.
Sorry, that answers the UBI part of it, but the question was about a job guarantee. Hang on.
I'm not going to talk about a job guarantee because I thought you were going to. So that's not good. That's not going to be part of the next session. But there is the world's biggest job guarantee is in India. It's the rural job guarantee that has 50 million people in a year. The second biggest job guarantee in recent times was in Argentina between 2002 and 2006. That had 2 million people, or 13% of the labor force in, after the Argentine crisis before the last one. There is a job guarantee trial in Austria at the moment. The Tasmanian state government last year, or Tasmanian Parliament last year, passed a motion requiring the Tasmanian government to study the introduction of a job guarantee in Tasmania. And Tammy Franks passed a bill, the first reading of a bill in South Australia last week for the same thing.
I think that's all we know about.
I wonder if it looks like we've only got 10 or maybe not even 10 minutes. I wonder, I don't know if there are other questions, but I'm just, as part of my own, or connected to my own research, I'm quite interested to know what people think about these two questions. Both of them are directly related to my own research. Do you think it would be a good idea to try to get everybody involved, or should we just keep going with questions, or what does everyone think?
We got, the audience is saying here, keep going with questions. What does everyone think online?
There's a question from Richard Lockie he'd like to ask, not related to UBI or job guarantees. So if we're still going with open questions, so we could go with this one. So Richard.
Hi, sorry, I'm quite happy to go with the flow as well. I'm just listening while I'm gardening and coming into the house briefly. I wanted just to check in with that, what the cross relation is with community currencies, like, just pure tracking of value on a, local level, does that, and there's an implication that connects that to some of these things that you guys are talking about, where instead of it coming from more a broad sort of area and distribution from a centralized point, more of a decentralized distribution point, and then therefore that that value gets more locally adopted through that. And just wondering if you're seeing much of that happening at all. Thanks.
Yeah, that's a great question, Richard. So in Byronshire, which is where I live, they did implement or tried to implement like a LETS scheme, for those who are familiar with that, like local exchange. I can't remember the exact acronym, but it is a community currency, as you suggested. I think Helena Norberg Hodge was connected to trialing it. And, it did have some success, but I asked her once this same question, why doesn't it still exist? As far as I know, it's not working at all anymore. And basically she said, well, it was good, it worked for, on some level for some small things, but ultimately people needed to pay just in line with the MMT story. People needed to pay their mortgages and needed to pay tax, and they needed to have this government issued currency, and that there was a much bigger demand for it. Ultimately what the utility of money comes down to is just getting everyone to accept to use it. So if you can get people to accept it, and to get them to accept it without forcing anyone to use it, that's really the thing. And that's actually a really crucial part in the MMT story. And it's sometimes not highlighted enough, I don't think. I mean, it is there, but that's really a crucial part. I mean, you said you came in a little bit later, but you might have missed it, Richard, but I'll just flick back to it. I mean, the first step was that I mentioned was that governments impose a tax liability. And so the flip side of a government's sovereign currency is actually a legal monopoly on the use of force, and threatening people that if you don't pay the tax in the currency that I use, then we're going to dispossess you of your land, or we're going to put you in jail, or whatever it is. So that's why there's such a great demand for the government's currency. I mean, I, for one, as Stephen Hale pointed out, there is in MMT purely a descriptive part, which I've heard Bill Mitchell, who's one of the progenitors of MMT, I've heard him refer to as classical MMT. And then all the prescriptive part, the value judgments that are imposed on what we should or shouldn't do about this system, they come later. And I for one, am not saying that we should use this system. I'm just saying that this is the way that the system is designed, that we have, courts that can levy fines or can send out court orders to put people in jail and dispossess people of their property. That's the reason why there's such a demand for this, for the government's currency. To come back to what you were saying about these community currencies, the local exchange networks, I mean, yeah, I think that they're great. They're a great idea. And I think that, again, I'm a little bit of a libertarian socialist. I would not like to see, I'm not promoting the use of force and trying to get people to pay taxes or to use any one or another currency. So sure, I mean, if people want to experiment with that, I think it's a great idea, and they should try and use them as much as they can.
Yep, thank you.
I have a question. What I don't understand is how a government, especially a conservative liberal government, has gone from austerity and obsession about balancing the budget to an MMT because of the pandemic, and now and many governments around the world are so comfortable with it. What was the psychological change, except outside of the pandemic, that made this happen?
Wow, that's a really great question. I'm not sure I can answer it really. What was the psychological change? I don't know, maybe because next year is an election year. I don't know. I mean, Australia had been, had uninterrupted growth for a quarter of a century up until I think it was just before the pandemic, or if it wasn't before the pandemic, then right at the beginning of the pandemic, and they were officially in recession. And maybe that was a little bit of a smite on the Australian national psyche, that actually our economies can have downturns as well. And I should say, even though it's not directly related to this, but I did kind of mention it, and I did put it up here as a limitation of MMT, is that there are real limitations to economic production. And if anyone has read the Australian State of the Environment reports, they're, by their own assessment, the largest and most comprehensive assessment of the state of the environment in Australia. You can go to their website. They've got piles of data. They publish every 5 years since 1996. The 2021 report is coming out early next year. They have a section in there on what they call drivers. What is driving the changes to the state of the Australian environment? And over time, from 1996 on, it becomes more and more bold in their assessment that fundamentally what is driving the ecological degradation of Australia is this commitment to growth. So, it's, at least by my assessment, it's a real problem where you have this nominal system which is dedicated to growing. And then you have these real limitations which are not growing. And Herman Daly has been banging on about this for half a century now. And I think he's absolutely right. But I've actually tried asking several times many MMT people to get their assessment on this second question, on this limitation that I've put up here. And actually, I haven't really gotten many great answers. In fact, I've gotten quite short. I asked Randall Ray this, and he got quite short with me, saying, "Oh, forget about this Herman Daly and limits to growth thing." But I think it's spot on. I think the evidence, to be honest, is overwhelming. I think this is actually a shortcoming of MMT, is that it doesn't have the same sort of natural scientific background and ecological sort of insight to look at what actually happens as an economy grows. I mean, yeah, we can get services, but when you come down to it, ultimately we can get more efficient and so on. But when you come right down to it, ultimately there are real limits to growth that demand, ultimately depending on low entropy matter and energy, as Herman Daly and Nikolai Georgescu-Roentgen have described. Sorry, I've forgotten even the original question now.
Sorry. I was just going to throw something in which might be helpful to people. In sort of my trying to understand how these things can come together as well, the ecological limits with the ability of a fiat government to spend on what it needs. There's a piece by Jason Hickel, which I think the title of it is called MMT and Degrowth, a Thought Experiment. And it's only a couple of pages. And that has been really helpful to me and other people, I think, in understanding how those two things work together. And Stephen can correct me if I'm wrong.
No, I just wanted to say, since I'm not talking about the job guarantee, this is precisely what I'm going to be talking about in the next session.
Oh, fantastic. I can't wait.
Excellent, everybody. So it's 2:32 on the final afternoon of the conference. The next session with Stephen Hale butts up to this one. So probably good to just have 5 minutes in between sessions to shake out the last bits of energy we have to get ramped up again for Stephen. So there were still questions in the chat box, but we can pass those over to Stephen. They're pretty technical ones, Jason, so you're off the hook for that. So everybody, I'd like to thank Jason Van Tol and Selvin Kwong and the population of gnomes that helped out as well. Hopefully no gnomes were injured in the course. I did see one fall over, but hopefully they're not too injured and will survive another presentation. But in the meantime, applause for the two presenters, and no doubt we'll probably see you all again in about 3 or 4 minutes' time for Stephen's talk. Thank you.
Thanks, everyone.
Thank you, Jason.
Thank you. Can I just ask, how do I get to Stephen's talk? Can I just stay on here or do I have to go somewhere else?
Yeah,
no,
you can.
Yeah, I was going to close it and reopen it so we've got separate recordings.
Okay. Yep. So, but
yeah, so
use the same link or?
Yes.
There will be. Yes. Okay. Yes.
Same link.
Yep. Thank you.
All right. Thanks, everybody.
Thank you.
Thank you. I'm not really talking about MMT.